I remember the smell of pine resin mixing with morning mist on that February dawn, the way it clung to my deerskin clothing and filled my lungs with each careful breath. I was crouched behind a snow-covered birch tree at the forest's edge, watching smoke rise from the English settlement below, thin grey columns reaching toward a sky that seemed too beautiful for what was about to unfold. My father stood beside me, his weathered hand gripping a tomahawk with such intensity that his knuckles had gone pale beneath his copper skin. He did not look at me, but I felt his presence like heat from a fire, steady and consuming. What I could not know then, as I watched my breath materialize in small clouds before my face, was that within hours, the world I understood would cease to exist, replaced by something so terrible that even now, decades later, the memory makes my hands tremble as I set these words to paper. The events that followed that morning would echo through generations, a wound that never fully healed, a story of loss so profound that it changed the very landscape of our existence. The settlement was called Deerfield, a collection of wooden houses arranged in neat rows along the frozen Deerfield River, protected by a palisade wall that the English believed made them safe from the wilderness that surrounded them on all sides. For months, we had observed them from the forest shadows, watching their patterns, learning their rhythms, noting when they drew water from the well, when they emerged to feed livestock, when they extinguished their candles at night. I had been part of these reconnaissance missions since the first snow, selected by the War Council because I moved quietly through the woods and had patience enough to remain still for hours while observing enemy positions. My people, the Pocumtuck, had been displaced from these very lands decades earlier, pushed north and west by English expansion that seemed to know no natural boundary. Now we had returned as part of a larger force, joined by Abenaki warriors from the north and French soldiers from New France, united by a common cause that seemed righteous to us then, though history would judge it through a lens we could not anticipate. The commander of our expedition was Jean-Baptiste Hertel de Rouville, a French officer whose face bore scars from previous wilderness campaigns. His eyes held a coldness that made even hardened warriors uncomfortable. He had addressed us the previous evening in our camp several miles north, speaking in French, while a translator converted his words into languages we understood. He spoke of glory, of striking a blow against the English, who continued to encroach upon lands that belonged to France's indigenous allies, of teaching a lesson that would resonate throughout the colonies. But I noticed he did not speak of mercy, did not mention the women and children who slept behind those wooden walls, did not acknowledge that warfare in this new world had taken on characteristics that our ancestors would have found dishonorable. When he finished speaking, my father had caught my eye across the fire, and in that brief glance, I saw something I had never seen before in a man who had faced death countless times without flinching. I saw doubt. Now, as dawn approached and our force of nearly 300 warriors and soldiers prepared for the attack, I found myself thinking about a conversation I had overheard between two English traders several months earlier. I had been hidden in tall grass near the settlement, close enough to smell the tobacco they smoked and hear every word they exchanged. One man had spoken about his daughter, about how she was learning to read from the Bible, about his hopes that she might marry a minister's son and live a good Christian life, far from the dangers of the frontier. The other man had laughed and said the frontier had a way of following people, that violence was the price of civilization in a savage land. I had not understood all their words then, my knowledge of English being limited and imperfect, but I understood enough to recognize that they saw themselves as innocent victims of an uncivilized world, never acknowledging that their presence itself was an act of violence against those who had lived here for generations beyond counting. The snow had been falling steadily for 3 days, accumulating in deep drifts that now reached nearly to the top of the palisade wall in some places. This was why we had waited, why de Rouville had held us back despite the growing restlessness among the warriors who wanted to strike and return home. Before the worst of winter set in, the snow had provided us with a natural siege ramp, a gift from the spirits or from chance, depending on what one chose to believe, as the sky began to lighten from black to deep blue, revealing stars that seemed to pulse with cold fire. Our force moved forward in near-perfect silence, hundreds of men crossing an open field without raising an alarm, the snow muffling our footfalls and the wind covering any inadvertent sound. I climbed the snowdrift alongside warriors I had known my entire life, men who had taught me to track deer through autumn forests, who had shown me how to read weather signs in the behavior of birds, who had shared their knowledge of which plants could heal and which could kill. Now, we carried weapons meant for killing humans, and our faces were painted with designs intended to strike terror into those who saw us. I tried to reconcile these two realities, the men I knew and the warriors we had become, but found the task impossible. Perhaps this is what war does to people, I thought as I reached the top of the palisade and looked down into the silent settlement. Perhaps it splits us into two selves that can never fully reconcile. The attack began with a gunshot, though I never learned who fired first or whether it was intentional or accidental. The sound shattered the morning silence like a rock through ice, and suddenly the world erupted into chaos that defied description. Warriors poured over the palisade walls and through gates that had been been left partially open, a catastrophic security failure that would later be attributed to guards who had fallen asleep during the bitter, cold night. Men emerged from houses in nightclothes, reaching for weapons they had no time to load or aim. Women screamed, their voices cutting through the morning air with such primal terror that even now I can hear them when I close my eyes. Children cried, confused and frightened by the violence that had invaded their homes without warning. I followed my father through a door that had been broken open by warriors ahead of us, entering a house that smelled of wood smoke and baking bread, incongruously domestic scents that clashed violently with the screaming and the clash of weapons echoing from every direction. A man stood at the far end of the room, attempting to load a musket with hands that shook so badly he kept dropping the powder. My father moved toward him without hesitation, and I turned away before I saw what happened next, unable to watch, even though I knew that hesitation in battle could mean death. I heard the sound, though, a wet impact followed by a strangled gasp, and then silence that seemed louder than any scream. In the corner of the room, partially hidden behind a wooden table, I saw a woman clutching two small children against her chest, her body curved around theirs in a protective embrace that reminded me painfully of my own mother. Our eyes met across the chaos, and in that instant I saw her recognize what I was, saw the terror that flooded through her like poison, saw her pull her children closer, as if her body alone could shield them from what was coming. I stood frozen, my tomahawk hanging useless at my side, unable to move forward or retreat, caught between the warrior I was supposed to be and the person I still hoped I might remain. My father's hand on my shoulder broke the spell. He said nothing, simply guided me back toward the door, away from the woman and her children, back into the street where the battle continued with undiminished intensity. I learned later that he had made a decision in that moment, a choice to spare them, though such mercy was not universal that morning. Other warriors showed no such restraint, driven by grief for their own losses, by rage at years of displacement and betrayal, by the intoxicating momentum of violence that feeds on itself and grows stronger with each act. The French soldiers, I noticed, seemed almost methodical in their brutality, executing their duties with the professional detachment of men who had done this before in other places, other wars, other circumstances that probably seemed equally justified at the time. As the sun rose higher, transforming the snow into fields of blinding white punctuated by spreading red stains, the nature of the attack shifted from battle to capture. Warriors began rounding up survivors, separating them into groups, making quick assessments about who could survive a winter march to New France and who could not. The old and infirm were generally killed where they stood, a brutal calculus that reflected the harsh reality that we faced a 200-mile journey through wilderness in the depths of winter with limited supplies. Children who could walk were spared, women of childbearing age were spared, men who seemed strong enough to survive captivity were spared. Everyone else became a liability that our leaders chose to eliminate rather than risk. I watched these selections being made with growing horror, understanding for the first time that what we were doing bore little resemblance to the warfare our grandfathers had practiced. The ritualized combat with clear rules about treatment of prisoners and respect for enemies who showed courage. This was something different, something that merged indigenous practices with European military doctrine to create a hybrid form of violence that maximized terror and displacement. The English settlers had names for what we did that morning: massacre, atrocity, savage warfare. But we had names too for what they had done to us over decades of expansion and broken treaties. Each side saw itself as responding to outrages committed by the other, locked in a cycle of violence that seemed to have no natural endpoint. By mid-morning, the settlement had been secured completely. Buildings burned, sending columns of black smoke into the clear winter sky that could probably be seen for miles in every direction. We knew this smoke would draw English soldiers from nearby garrisons, that we had limited time to gather our captives and supplies and begin the long march north before pursuit could be organized. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, looting houses for anything useful: blankets, food, gunpowder, tools that could be traded or used. I saw men carrying items that seemed almost absurdly mundane given the circumstances: a copper pot, a bolt of cloth, a small mirror that caught the sunlight and threw brilliant reflections across the snow. Among the captives, I noticed a girl who appeared to be about my own age, perhaps 15 or 16 winters. She stood with remarkable composure considering the circumstances, her blonde hair matted with blood from a cut on her forehead, her dress torn but her spine straight and her eyes clear. She was helping a younger child, perhaps her sister, trying to keep the little one calm despite the chaos surrounding them. I found myself drawn to her courage, to the way she refused to break even as her world literally burned around her. When our eyes met briefly, I saw no hatred there, only a kind of resigned determination to survive whatever came next. I wondered what she saw when she looked at me, whether she could recognize any humanity beneath the paint and the weapons and the violence I represented. The captive column formed slowly, more than 100 prisoners shackled together. With rope and rawhide, many of them barefoot despite the snow, dressed in nightclothes or whatever they had been able to grab before being dragged from their burning homes. The French commander moved among them, making additional selections, ordering certain prisoners released because they would slow our march too much. I saw an elderly man collapse to his knees in the snow, thanking God for his release, not understanding that he was being left behind to freeze or starve in the ruins of his settlement. His wife, younger and stronger, was kept with the captive column, and I watched her pulled away from him, her screams cutting through the morning air as she tried to fight back to his side. Warriors pushed her forward roughly, and eventually her resistance faded into the exhausted acceptance that characterized most of the prisoners by this point. We began the march north in early afternoon, a long column of captors and captives, winding through snow-covered forest, along trails only the indigenous warriors knew. The French soldiers moved in formation at the front and rear, maintaining military discipline even in the wilderness. Between them walked or stumbled the prisoners, many already exhausted from the morning's trauma, struggling to keep pace despite wounds and cold, and the psychological shock of losing everything they had known in the span of a few brutal hours. I walked near the middle of the column, close enough to my father that I could see him constantly scanning the forest around us, alert for pursuit or ambush, his face set in an expression I could not read. That first day of the march remains fragmented in my memory, a series of disconnected images that my mind struggled to process coherently. I remember a woman collapsing in the snow, unable to rise despite the threats and the blows, until finally a warrior raised his tomahawk and her suffering ended with a speed that might have been the only mercy she received that day. I remember a child crying endlessly for her mother who was somewhere else in the column, her small voice growing hoarser with each passing hour until it faded to silence. I remember the way the snow seemed to absorb sound, creating pockets of eerie quiet, broken only by the crunch of footsteps and the occasional sob or prayer muttered in English. I remember thinking that surely this could not be what honor looked like, what justice required, what our ancestors would have wanted us to become. We camped that night in a shallow valley that offered some protection from the wind, though protection was relative in temperatures that could kill exposed flesh within minutes. The prisoners were given minimal food and no shelter, forced to huddle together for warmth, while guards watched to prevent escape attempts that would have been suicidal in these conditions anyway. I sat near a fire with several other young warriors, none of us speaking, all of us lost in private thoughts about what we had done and what it meant. One of them, a boy named Konia, who I had played with as a child, eventually broke the silence to ask whether we were still the same people we had been that morning. No one answered him because none of us knew what to say. The blonde girl I had noticed earlier sat among a group of women and children at the edge of the firelight, still maintaining her protective stance around the smaller child I assumed was her sister. Even from a distance I could see she was studying our camp, memorizing details, analyzing patterns of guard rotation and supply storage. She was planning something, I realized, either escape or resistance, or simply gathering information for some future use. I found myself hoping she would not try to escape. The forest would kill her more certainly than any warrior, and death by freezing was among the worst ways to die. But I also admired her refusal to simply accept captivity passively, her determination to maintain some form of agency, even in circumstances that stripped away almost every freedom. The march continued for days that blended together into a continuous ordeal of cold and exhaustion and quiet desperation. More prisoners died along the way, their bodies left in the snow because we had neither time nor resources to bury them properly. The survivors grew increasingly numb, not just from the cold but from the psychological weight of their situation, their faces taking on the blank expression of people pushed beyond the limits of what the human mind can process and still remain functional. Some prayed constantly, their lips moving in silent recitation of scriptures that promised salvation, or at least meaning in suffering. Others seemed to retreat entirely into themselves, walking mechanically when commanded to walk, stopping when commanded to stop, existing in some internal space where the external reality could not fully reach them. I found myself thinking often about the trader's conversation I had overheard months earlier, about his daughter who was learning to read the Bible, about his hopes for her future. Was she among these prisoners, I wondered? Had she watched her father die that morning? Would she survive to reach New France? And if so, what would become of her there? These questions haunted me because I knew the answers would not provide comfort, regardless of what they were. The French and their indigenous allies had their own purposes for these captives. Some would be adopted into indigenous communities to replace those lost to disease or war. Some would be ransomed back to English colonies for profit or political advantage. Some would spend years or even lives in captivity that might range from relatively benign to unimaginably cruel, depending on circumstances and individual temperaments of their captors. About a week into the march, the anticipated pursuit finally caught up with us. English soldiers and their indigenous allies attacked our column just before dawn, attempting to free the captives and punish those who had raided Deerfield. The battle that followed was brief but intense, fought in close quarters among snow-covered trees with visibility limited by morning fog. I found myself facing an English soldier who could not have been much much older than me, both of us fumbling with weapons we had trained with but never truly mastered, both of us terrified and trying to hide it beneath aggressive posturing. We circled each other for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, neither of us eager to initiate the violence that could end with one or both of us dead in the snow. The decision was made for us when my father emerged from the fog and struck the soldier from behind, a blow that sent him to his knees but did not kill him immediately. I saw the young man's face contort with pain and confusion, saw him try to rise and fail, saw the light begin to fade from his eyes even as they remained fixed on mine, with an expression that seemed to be asking why. My father handed me his knife and stepped back, waiting. And I understood that this was meant to be some kind of test or ritual, a moment where I would prove myself by finishing what had been started. I knelt beside the dying soldier, the knife heavy in my hand, and I saw in his face a mirror of my own fear and uncertainty. When I finally completed the act, I did it as quickly and cleanly as I could, trying to minimize suffering even though I knew such mercy was inadequate compensation for taking a life. The English attack was eventually repelled, but we lost several warriors and a handful of prisoners who managed to escape in the confusion. The successful escapees would carry news of our route and numbers back to English authorities, which meant we needed to increase our pace and alter our path to avoid further pursuit. This, in turn, meant more hardship for the captives, many of whom were already at the limits of their endurance. So over the following days, I watched the column shrink as more prisoners died or were killed when they could no longer keep up. The calculations became starker. Every person who slowed the column put everyone else at risk, so eliminating the weak became a matter of survival rather than cruelty. Or at least that was how we justified it to ourselves. The blonde girl and her younger sister somehow managed to survive, though I could see the toll the journey was taking on both of them. The older girl walked with a pronounced limp from frostbitten toes, and the younger one had developed a terrible cough that rattled in her small chest like stones in a gourd. Still, they persevered with a resilience that seemed almost superhuman, the older sister somehow finding reserves of strength to carry the younger one when necessary, to share what little food they received, to maintain hope when every rational assessment of their situation suggested hopelessness was the only reasonable response. One evening, after we had made camp and I was helping to distribute the meager rations to prisoners, I found myself standing near the two sisters. The older girl looked up at me with those clear eyes that had not lost their sharp intelligence despite everything, and she spoke to me in halting, accented words that I slowly realized were in my own language. She had been listening to us, I understood, with a start, learning phrases and patterns, building a vocabulary that might help her negotiate or manipulate or simply communicate with her captors. She asked me, in words carefully assembled from fragments she had collected, whether her sister would live. The question was direct and unadorned by the social niceties that usually cushioned such dire inquiries, and it demanded an honest answer. I looked at the younger girl, seeing the fever flush on her cheeks and the labored breathing that suggested her body was losing the fight against cold and infection. I could have lied, offered false hope that might make the moment easier to bear. Instead, I told the truth as gently as I could, explaining that the cold was powerful and that the journey was still long and that the spirits would decide who walked through to the other side and who did not. I saw her absorb this information without breaking, saw her nod once and then turn back to her sister with renewed determination, as if my honesty had somehow given her permission to fight even harder against the inevitable. That night, I dreamed of my own sisters, safe in our winter camp far to the north. Unaware of what I had become and what I had done, I woke before dawn with tears frozen to my cheeks and a certainty that something fundamental had broken inside me that morning in Deerfield, something that would never fully heal, regardless of how many seasons passed or what explanations I constructed to justify my actions. I understood then what my father's doubt had meant, why those who had seen combat before approached warfare with grim resignation rather than enthusiasm. Violence, I had learned, diminishes both those who suffer it and those who inflict it, leaving everyone marked in ways that transcend the physical scars and persist long after wounds have healed. We reached French territory after nearly 3 weeks of march, crossing into lands where the threat of English pursuit diminished, and we could finally allow ourselves to believe we would survive to see our homes again. The captives, or at least those who had survived the journey, were distributed according to plans made before the raid. Some went to French authorities who would attempt to ransom them back to English colonies, a business transaction that reduced human beings to monetary value. Others were given to indigenous communities to be adopted or enslaved depending on local customs and the perceived characteristics of individual prisoners. A few, those judged to pose the greatest risk of escape or resistance, were kept under close guard in French military facilities to await decisions from officials in Quebec or Montreal. The blonde girl and her sister were among a group assigned to an Abenaki village several days' journey from where we separated from the main column. I watched them walk away, the older girl still supporting the younger one despite her own obvious exhaustion and pain, and I felt a complex mixture of relief that they had survived, and guilt that their suffering was partially my responsibility, and uncertainty about what their lives would become in the months and years ahead. I never learned their names, never discovered whether the younger sister survived her illness, or whether the older one eventually escaped, or adapted to captivity, or was ransomed home. They simply disappeared into the vast network of indigenous communities in New France, two more individuals swept up in forces far larger than any single person could control or even fully comprehend. My father and I, along with the other Pocumtuck warriors, continued north to our own winter camps, carrying with us items we had taken from Deerfield and stories we would be expected to tell about our courage and success in striking a blow against our enemies. But as we traveled through familiar forests toward familiar places, I found I had no enthusiasm for the triumphant homecoming that others anticipated. The items I carried felt heavy with the weight of their former owners, ghosts that whispered accusations in the quiet moments when I tried to rest. The stories I had to tell were not the simple narratives of heroism and justice that our community wanted to hear, but complex accounts of moral ambiguity and casual cruelty and the slow erosion of everything I had believed about honor and warfare. When we finally reached our village, my mother wept to see me return safely, and my sisters asked eager questions about my experiences and whether I had counted coup or distinguished myself in battle. I told them what they wanted to hear, providing edited versions of events that emphasized bravery and downplayed brutality. That framed everything as necessary response to English aggression rather than acknowledging the moral compromises and deliberate choices that had characterized the raid. Only with my father did I speak honestly, and even then only late at night when others slept and we could maintain the fiction of privacy in our small dwelling. He told me that he had participated in many raids and battles over his life, that each one had taken something from him that he could never recover, that the cumulative weight of violence committed and witnessed had gradually transformed him into someone his younger self would not recognize. He said that he had hoped to spare me this particular education, to preserve my innocence a while longer, but that circumstances and duties had made such preservation impossible. He explained that we lived in a time when old certainties no longer held, when the arrival of Europeans had fundamentally altered the nature of existence in ways that extended far beyond mere territorial disputes, that forced impossible choices on people who had never asked to be placed in such positions. I listened to his words and understood that he was trying to provide context, to help me process experiences that threatened to overwhelm my capacity to integrate them into a coherent sense of self. But I also recognized that no amount of context could fully absolve what we had done, could restore life to those we had killed, or innocence to those we had traumatized. The raid on Deerfield was a single event in a much larger conflict, a small battle in a war that would continue for generations. But for those of us who participated and those who suffered through it, the experience remained intensely personal and permanent. The months that followed my return were difficult in ways I had not anticipated. I found myself unable to take pleasure in activities that had once brought joy. Hunting felt too much like stalking human prey. Celebrations seemed obscene, given what I knew about the cost of our victory. Even simple conversations with friends became exhausting, as I struggled to maintain the pretense that I had not been fundamentally changed by what I had experienced. I began to avoid social gatherings, preferring solitude where I did not have to perform normalcy or explain my perpetual state of internal conflict. Other warriors from the raid seemed to handle the aftermath differently. Some embraced the role of victorious fighter, retelling stories of the battle with enthusiasm and embellishment, apparently untroubled by doubts or guilt. Others never spoke of it at all, maintaining absolute silence about their experiences, regardless of how others pressed them for details. A few, like my father, occupied a middle ground where they acknowledged participation but refused to glorify or condemn their actions, treating the raid as simply one more event in a life filled with difficult choices and ambiguous outcomes. I tried to adopt this middle stance, but found it impossible to maintain. My dreams remained haunted by faces of those I had seen killed or captured, by the sounds of screaming that echoed through Deerfield that morning, by the memory of the younger sister's cough rattling in her chest as she walked toward an uncertain fate. I began to wake frequently in the night, my heart racing with adrenaline meant for threats that no longer existed, my body remembering fear and violence even when my conscious mind tried to move past them. By the time spring arrived and the ice began to break on the rivers, I had made a decision that would have seemed impossible to my younger self just months earlier. I could not continue living among my people while carrying the weight of what I had done, could not participate in the daily routines and social expectations of the community while knowing how profoundly I had been transformed by violence. I told my father that I intended to travel west, to seek out relatives in more distant regions, to perhaps find some way to reconcile what I had become with what I still hoped I might be. He did not try to dissuade me, perhaps recognizing that some journeys are necessary even when they lead to uncertain destinations. Before I left, he gave me a small bundle wrapped in soft deerskin, telling me not to open it until I had traveled far enough that our village was no longer visible from the highest hill. I honored his request, walking for most of a day before finally sitting beside a clear stream and unwrapping the gift. Inside I found a wampum belt, not the kind used for important ceremonies or significant transactions, but a personal item, handmade with care and marked with symbols I slowly realized told the story of our family across multiple generations. At the center of the design, my father had added a new section that represented me, showing a figure standing between two worlds, neither fully part of one nor the other, suspended in the painful space where opposing forces meet and clash. I sat beside that stream for a long time, holding the wampum belt and understanding what my father had tried to tell me through its design. He had recognized in me what perhaps I had not yet fully acknowledged, that I belonged neither to the world before Deerfield nor to the world after, that the raid had split me into fragments that would never entirely reunite. The belt was both acknowledgement and acceptance, a way of saying that transformation, even painful transformation, was part of being human, that identity was not fixed, but fluid, shaped by experiences we did not choose and consequences we could not escape. I continued west as planned, traveling through territories where stories of the Deerfield raid had spread, but where my personal connection to it remained unknown. I worked as a translator occasionally, my knowledge of English and French making me valuable to traders and diplomats. Navigating the complex political landscape of indigenous communities caught between competing European powers, I married eventually, though I never told my wife the full truth about what I had experienced that February morning, protecting her from knowledge that would have served no purpose except to disturb her peace. Years passed, then decades. The war between France and England that had provided context for the Deerfield raid eventually ended with treaties that transferred vast territories between empires with no regard for indigenous people who actually lived on those lands. New wars began, involving new alliances and new grievances, but following remarkably similar patterns of violence and displacement. I watched these cycles repeat with a weary recognition that human beings seemed incapable of learning from history, doomed to perpetually recreate conflicts that served no one well except those few who profited from war itself. I heard occasional news about captives from Deerfield, fragmentary reports that some had been ransomed home while others had chosen to remain with indigenous communities, their children growing up as members of Abenaki or Mohawk or other nations, creating connections between cultures even as those cultures continued to battle each other. I never learned specifically what happened to the blonde girl and her sister, but I imagined many possible outcomes, each one painful in its own way: death from illness, successful escape back to English territory, reluctant adoption into an indigenous community, a life suspended between worlds like my own. In my old age, I found myself drawn to the places where indigenous people gathered to share stories and maintain traditions that European colonization was rapidly eroding. I listened to their accounts of battles and raids, heard them describe their enemies as savage and cruel, recognized in their words the same certainty about righteousness that I had once felt before experiencing the reality of violence firsthand. I wanted to interrupt, to explain that things were more complicated than their stories acknowledged, that both sides had committed atrocities and both sides had suffered grievous losses. That reducing complex human experiences to simple narratives of good and evil did injustice to everyone involved. But I remained silent, understanding that such interventions would be unwelcome, that people needed their certainties and their simplified stories to make sense of chaotic realities. Only occasionally, when young warriors expressed enthusiasm about proving themselves in battle, did I speak up to offer gentle warnings about the cost of violence, the permanent marks it leaves on those who participate, regardless of which side claims victory. Most ignored my cautions, viewing me as an old man who had grown soft or cowardly with age. A few listened thoughtfully, perhaps recognizing in my words an authenticity that came from direct experience rather than abstract moralizing. I am old now, old enough that my body feels the cold far more than it once did, old enough that memories of that February morning remain more vivid than events from last week, old enough to know that I will not live many more seasons. I have spent much of my life trying to understand what happened in Deerfield, to place it in context that makes sense, to derive meaning from suffering that often seems meaningless. I have failed in this task more often than I have succeeded, finding that some experiences resist interpretation, that some events carry weight that cannot be lifted through analysis or understanding. What I learned that morning, and in the weeks that followed, was that violence transforms everyone it touches, that there are no clean hands in war, that the stories we tell ourselves about honor and justice often crumble when tested against reality. I learned that courage and cruelty can coexist in the same person, that good people can commit terrible acts when circumstances and duties align in particular ways, that moral clarity is often the first casualty of actual combat. I learned that victims and perpetrators are not always distinct categories, that people can occupy both roles simultaneously or sequentially, that the line between resistance and aggression depends largely on perspective. negative. Most painfully, I learned that knowledge does not lead inevitably to wisdom. That understanding the causes and contexts of violence does not make that violence any less devastating to those who suffer it. The English settlers in Deerfield had their reasons for being there, for building homes and farms in territory that had belonged to my ancestors. We had our reasons for attacking them, for trying to drive them back through force when every other approach had failed. Neither set of reasons made the resulting violence any less real or any less tragic for individuals caught in its wake. The younger sister from Deerfield, the one with the rattling cough who I believed would not survive the winter, she haunts me most consistently in my final years. I do not know whether she lived or died, whether she grew to adulthood or perished in that frozen forest during the march to New France. I do not know her name, do not know what dreams she harbored before that February morning, do not know what her life might have become if history had followed different paths, but I carry her with me always, a reminder that behind every statistic about casualties and captives, there existed real individuals, with hopes and fears and connections to others who loved them and mourned their loss. Sometimes, in moments of particular despair, I have wondered whether it would have been better if I had died that day, instead of surviving to carry these memories forward through decades of troubled reflection. But I recognize this wondering as both futile and perhaps even cowardly. We do not choose the experiences that shape us, only how we respond to them afterward. My response has been to bear witness, to preserve a truthful account, even when truth is uncomfortable and unwelcome, to resist the simplifying narratives that both sides have constructed around events like the Deerfield raid. As I approach the end of my life, I find myself thinking often about what will happen when the last person who directly experienced that morning has died, when there are no longer any living witnesses to contradict or complicate the stories that have already begun to calcify into historical myth. Will future generations understand the complexity of what happened, or will they reduce it to simple tales of savage Indians attacking innocent settlers, with no acknowledgement of the displacement and broken treaties and systematic violence that provided context? Will anyone remember that we too were people, not monsters, that we made impossible choices in circumstances we did not create, that we suffered our own losses and carried our own wounds? I do not know the answers to these questions, and I have come to accept that I will die without knowing. What I can do is leave this account, imperfect and partial as it necessarily is, in hope that someone in some future generation might read it and recognize that history is never as simple as we want it to be, that every event involves human beings with their own perspectives and justifications and pain. If this record serves any purpose, let it be to complicate rather than clarify, to raise questions rather than provide answers, to remind people that violence always costs more than those who initiate it, anticipate. The morning of the Deerfield raid destroyed a settlement and decimated an indigenous force through subsequent retaliations and the grinding consequences of colonial warfare. But more than that, it destroyed illusions about honor in warfare, about moral clarity in conflict, about the possibility of violence that does not corrupt both perpetrator and victim. These may be the raid's most lasting casualties, the invisible wounds that persist long after physical destruction has been rebuilt and survivors have tried to resume their lives. I write these words in winter, as snow falls outside the small dwelling where I have lived these final years. The snow reminds me of that February morning 7 decades past, of drifts that enabled our attack, of white expanses stained red, of cold that killed as certainly as any weapon. But mostly it reminds me of the blonde girl and her sister, walking away into an uncertain future, disappearing into whiteness that swallowed them completely. I hope they survived. I hope they found some measure of peace, despite everything they endured. I hope that somewhere in some way they were able to build lives that contain joy as well as memory of suffering. But hope, I have learned, is not the same as knowledge, and wanting something to be true does not make it so. The likely reality is that one or both sisters died during or shortly after their captivity, that the younger girl's cough proved fatal, as I feared it would, that the older girl's resilience eventually reached its limits and failed. This is what usually happened to captives in that time and place. They died or they survived at tremendous psychological and physical cost, carrying scars both visible and invisible for whatever remained of their lives. As I set down these final words, my hand cramped from the unfamiliar effort of writing in English letters. I am struck by the inadequacy of language to fully convey experience. How can marks on paper transmit the sound of a child's scream cut short? How can words capture the weight of a moment when moral certainty crumbles and leaves nothing but confusion in its wake? How can description approach the terrible intimacy of violence, the way it links perpetrator and victim in bonds that neither chose and neither can fully sever? These questions have no satisfactory answers, which perhaps is itself an answer of sorts. Some experiences exceed our capacity to communicate them, leaving gaps between what happened and what can be told, between memory and expression. I have done my best to bridge these gaps, to offer testament that respects both what occurred and what cannot be fully known. Whether I have succeeded is not for me to judge. I can only hope that in failing to provide clean narratives or comfortable conclusions, conclusions, I have at least avoided the greater failure of pretending that such things are possible when dealing with events as complex and devastating as what unfolded in Deerfield that February morning in 1704. The raid ended, lives ended, worlds ended, but the consequences continue, rippling forward through generations, shaping conflicts and attitudes and possibilities in ways that persist long after specific details fade from active memory. This is the true legacy of violence, not just the immediate death and destruction, but the lasting distortion of relationships and perspectives, the wounds that never fully heal, the questions that remain unanswered because we eliminated the people who could have answered them. I am ready now for the final silence, ready to join those who fell that morning and in the days that followed, ready to relinquish the burden of memory that I have carried for so long. My hope is that this account will survive, even as I do not. That it will serve as evidence that events we discuss as history were lived experiences for real people who deserve to be remembered as something more than abstractions or statistics. The blonde girl and her sister, the English soldier who died with questions in his eyes, the elderly man left to freeze in the ruins of his settlement, the warriors who marched through snow carrying their own invisible wounds, all of them were human beings whose lives had meaning beyond the roles they played in one morning's violence. In the end, this is what I learned and what I hope to pass forward, that we must resist the stories that divide people into simple categories of good and evil, innocent and guilty, civilized and savage. Reality is far more complicated, and the complications matter profoundly because they represent the actual texture of human experience. The Deerfield raid was not a simple tale of savage attack on innocent victims, but neither was it a justifiable act of resistance against colonial oppression. It was violence, with all the moral ambiguity and permanent damage that violence entails, committed by human beings against other human beings, in circumstances where both sides believed they were acting righteously. That belief in righteousness is perhaps the most dangerous thing of all, I have come to think in these final years. It allows us to commit acts we would otherwise recognize as wrong, to justify cruelty in service of causes we consider noble, to create suffering while maintaining certainty about our own moral standing. If there is a lesson to be drawn from Deerfield and from the countless similar events throughout history, it is that we should be profoundly suspicious of such certainty, that we should approach every use of violence with humility about our capacity for self-deception and self-justification. The fire is burning low now, and I am too tired to add more wood. Outside, the snow continues to fall, covering the world in white that makes everything look clean and new, hiding the complexity beneath. It is a beautiful lie, this fresh snow, suggesting that the past can be buried and forgotten, that we can start over without carrying forward the weight of what came before. But I know better. The snow will melt, revealing everything beneath it. Just as time eventually reveals the consequences of violence we hoped might remain hidden. I close this account without resolution, because there is no resolution, only continuation. The pattern of displacement and violence that produced the Deerfield raid has not ended, but merely transformed, taking new shapes while maintaining essential characteristics. Indigenous people continue to lose land and autonomy, continue to be caught between forces that view them as obstacles or tools rather than as people with inherent rights and dignity. The specific circumstances change, but the underlying dynamic persists, a wound that bleeds across generations. Perhaps that is the final tragedy, not just what happened in Deerfield, but what continues to happen, the perpetual recreation of conditions that make such violence seem necessary or inevitable. We learn the details of individual events without learning the deeper lessons that might actually change patterns. We remember specific dates and names while forgetting the systems and assumptions that produce the conflicts we commemorate. We tell ourselves we are different from those who came before, that we would never commit their mistakes, all while creating new versions of the same fundamental errors. I have no solution to offer, no wisdom that might break these cycles. I'm simply an old man who witnessed one small piece of a much larger tragedy, who has spent his life trying to make sense of what he saw and what he did. If my failure to find satisfying answers frustrates those who read this account, then perhaps that frustration itself is valuable. A reminder that some questions resist resolution, that some wounds cannot be cleanly healed, that some aspects of human experience remain perpetually unfinished business. The younger sister's cough, that rattling sound that followed me through decades, I can hear it still in quiet moments. A ghost that refuses to be laid to rest. I do not know if she died or lived, do not know if her suffering was brief or prolonged, do not know if she ever found any measure of peace or happiness after that terrible winter. But I know she was real as I am, as deserving of life and love and possibility. Whatever happened to her was not abstract history, but lived experience, and that distinction matters even when we cannot fully comprehend what it means. I set down my pen. The story is told, incomplete and unsatisfying as it must be. Outside, the snow continues to fall, indifferent to human suffering and human attempts to make sense of that suffering. Inside, the fire dies to embers, providing just enough warmth to sustain life a little longer. longer, and somewhere in the space between darkness and light, memory and forgetting, I wait for whatever comes next, carrying still the weight of that February morning in 1704, when the world ended for some and was forever altered for others, and nothing that followed could ever make it right again.